Durban is known for a lot of things. It is the Zulu men's Josie, home to violent taxi drivers, chart-topping rappers, beautiful Zulu hands, and of course, it is home to the biggest concentration of Indians in South Africa, or all of Africa, I believe. And I want to know how. Their history and their culture is interwoven into the fabric of this corrupt, money-laundering nation. Durban curry would not curry the way that it curries without them. Let's be for real. Hello, I'm Youngs, and today we will be discussing South African Indian history. We will be going over how and when Indian South Africans were brought to South Africa and how they survived one of the most brutal eras in our country's history. First, we need to discuss how India was colonized by the bloody British. You have no spices in your neighborhood, who you gonna call India. That was the tune in pre-colonial times. India was the Beyonce of global trade. Spices, textiles, tea, cotton and indigo dye, among other goods, were all sourced from the region. Through Asian ports and networks like the Silk Roads, India exported goods to Africa, East Asia, as well as the Roman Empire. They played not when it came to quality and good service. In the 1600s, a couple of British merchants who wished to buy goods from India for resale in England started a powerful private trading company known as the East India Company. After failing to compete with the Dutch, the French and the Portuguese down in the East Indies, they turned their attention to southern India. At this time, India was under the rule of the Mughal Empire, which ruled over South Asia from the 16th to the 18th century. Mughal rulers loved them some good business. A you scratch my back, I scratch yours type deal was made with the British traders. The merchants agreed to import European products in exchange for trading rights in the area, and from there, trade expanded and the British built posts and factories all across the nation. But then things soured. The British were never satisfied. They wanted more and more privileges, and the Mughal rulers finally put their foot down. This sparked the Anglo-Mughal War, a 4-year conflict that led to the defeat of the English merchants in 1690. All the English had to do was apologize and pay a fine for all to be well again. We had 4 years of war and they only had to pay a fine. What in the daylight robbery was this? The sitting emperor had more smoke for his ops in the Maratha Empire to care about what the English lads were up to, and this of course served as a distraction that would cost India its power and unfortunately its freedom. We must discuss the Battle of Plassey. In 1756, Suraj Ad-Doula rose up the ranks, becoming the new Nawab of Bengal. What's in the bananas is a Nawab, you ask? A Nawab was the title given to a native governor during the time of the Mughal Empire. The Nawab was able to rule Bengal, which was very wealthy and a center of international trade. Independently around this time, the French and the British had the largest trading companies in India, and Suraj was no fan of the British. I think that 4-year war had something to do with it, but of course, the British just concluded it was because he loved the French more. Of course. I mean, he again tried to cut the British off by capturing one of their forts, and again, they waged war. And because leaders care far more about their own interests than the well-being of the people they want to have power over, the hand of the Bengali army agreed to betray Siraj in order to advance his career and be the new Nawab. Siraj lost and Jafar took over as the new Nawab. He helped remove the French as competitors to the British. The East India Company had its own private army made up of Indian soldiers known as sepoys. They helped the company dethrone any prince who did not wish to advance British rule in India. While some Indians were able to keep their heads above water by operating businesses that served the British, many lived in squalor. Many workers were forced to lower their asking price for goods while being forced to buy British products at astronomical prices. Britain profited of these new trade laws, making enough to build factories and set in motion the Industrial Revolution. Around this time, up to 10 million Indians died of starvation and illness due to what is now known as the Bengal famine. It's what all those kids and none of you give a damn about have been facing for years in Congo and Sudan. Some familiar? By 1757, the East India Company had control of the nation's government, the economy, and its education system. The sepoys, you know, that army teeming with Indian soldiers? Yeah, well, they turned on the British at last. You know it's just a little too late. So why were they ready to turn on their overlords? They felt like Indian values were not being respected. See, before TikTokers were a thing, humans spread information the old-fashioned way, through whispers, through gossip. Members of the army were told they'd be getting new weaponry, a rifle that had pig and cow grease on its casings they would have to bite off in order to fire the weapon, which was not very halal of the British, if you ask me. Muslims and Hindus were not having it. A rebellion began, and after 18 months of infighting, the sepoys were defeated. In 1858, through the Government of India Act, the British government took control of India. By the way, all of those white society was always protective of women and children type people. You need to come to the front of the congregation. You all have bubbles. I am eager to burst. Remember those factories the British built? Yeah, well, guess who worked in them? The lower class people, which at the time were women and children. Child labor is always the best kind of labor. Those little boogers don't know much about money and workers' rights. And the women, they had no rights either, so it was fair game. They worked long hours and faced harsh punishment if they worked too slow. It was hell, but hey, the British government has always been the devil, so fitting. Now we need to travel back down to the scene of the crime, South Africa. But before we get there, we have to talk about the Boers. Or let's stop softening it and just be honest. The Dutch. Because by the 1500s and 1600s, the Dutch were not just participating in global trade, they were dominating it. Fueled by ego as much as ambition, they sailed further, faster, and more efficiently than most of Europe. They mastered capitalism before capitalism even had a name. They built wealth on salt, spices, shipping routes, and carefully negotiated alliances. But for all their power, the Dutch had one fundamental problem. They were not free. At the time, the Netherlands existed under the rule of the Spanish king, Philip II. Yes, that Philip, ruler of one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. The Dutch provinces were part of the Holy Roman Empire and deeply entangled with the French Kingdom of Burgundy. When the Duke of Burgundy died without a male heir, the Low Countries, what we now call the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, I know I pronounced that incorrectly, were passed down to the Habsburg family. And the Habsburgs were experts at one thing above all else: political marriages. They married into Spanish royalty, consolidating power while spreading risk. Control of Dutch land quietly slid into Spanish hands, not through conquest, but through paperwork, bloodlines, and crowns. And then Europe cracked open. The Protestant Reformation tore through the continent, challenging the absolute authority of the Catholic Church. In northern regions, including the Dutch provinces, people embraced Protestantism and Reformed Christianity. Spain did not tolerate dissent. What followed was violent suppression, public executions, torture, religious persecution, all in the name of Catholic supremacy. This eruption became known as the Dutch Revolt, one of the most consequential uprisings in European history. And at its center stood William of Orange, William the Silent, a nobleman who chose rebellion over comfort, a strategist, a leader, and eventually a martyr. William did not just fight Spain, he challenged the idea that empires had divine authority over people. His resistance laid the groundwork for an independent Netherlands and reshaped how Europe thought about sovereignty and freedom. After decades of bloodshed, the Dutch finally broke free. And what emerged was the Dutch Republic, wealthy, modern, commercially obsessed, and hungry for global influence. So they did what newly liberated powers often do. They expanded. With unmatched ships and ruthless efficiency, the Dutch went global. They reached the Caribbean, they reached Indonesia, they reached India, and eventually South Africa. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, established a refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope. On paper, this was harmless, just a stopover, a place to restock food and water for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. But colonialism never stays small. That station grew into settlement. Settlement grew into farms. Farms grew into ownership. Ownership grew into domination. The Dutch settlers who stayed became known as Boers, also known as farmers. But they weren't just farming land, they were occupying it. The Cape was already home to the Khoisan people, pastoralists and hunter-gatherers who had lived on that land for thousands of years. But the Dutch applied a familiar colonial lie: terra nullius, nobody's land. If you pretend people don't count, you don't have to feel guilty when you remove them. Through violence, disease, forced labor, and manipulated trade, indigenous communities were pushed off their land and erased from power. And here's where the story widens. Because the Dutch didn't only exploit African labor, they imported labor. Enslaved people were brought to the Cape from Indonesia, Madagascar, East Africa, and South Asia. These communities shaped the culture, the language, and the survival of the colony, even as they were denied humanity. Afrikaans itself, often framed as a white language, was formed through the tongues of enslaved people, servants, and the colonized. It is a Creole language born out of domination, not purity. Later, when the British took control of the Cape, the system expanded again. After slavery was abolished in the 1800s, the empire still needed cheap, controllable labor. So they turned to India. Between 1860 and 1900, thousands of Indian people were brought to South Africa as indentured laborers, especially to work on sugar plantations in Natal. They were promised opportunity, but what they received was exploitation. Indenture wasn't freedom, it was slavery, but with paperwork. Indian workers were trapped in contracts they could not escape, punished brutally and segregated by race, placed somewhere between black Africans and whites in a carefully engineered hierarchy. And this is the key thing to understand. South Africa wasn't built on one system of oppression, it was built on layers of it. But here is what colonial records often try to erase. The Indian community in South Africa did not arrive quietly, and they did not remain silent. From the very beginning, Indian South Africans resisted the systems designed to break them. They organized, they protested, they built institutions where the state offered none. And yes, this is where that son of a bitch, that piece of garbage, that evil little man, Mahatma Gandhi, enters the story. Gandhi arrived in South Africa in 1893 as a young lawyer, long before he became a global symbol. What he encountered here was raw institutional racism, laws that stripped Indian people of dignity, mobility, and basic human rights. He was thrown off a train for sitting in a whites-only carriage. He witnessed Indian workers beaten, underpaid, and criminalized for simply existing. South Africa became the laboratory for Gandhi's political awakening. That robe-wearing, smiggle-looking cunt may have been anti-black, but one thing he sure did not play about was his people. It was here that he developed satyagraha, non-violent resistance, not as a moral performance, but as a survival strategy. Indian South Africans organized mass protests against past laws, registration requirements, and discriminatory taxes. They went to prison, they faced violence, they refused compliance. But resistance wasn't only political, it was economic and cultural too. Despite being locked out of land ownership and formal power, Indian communities built businesses from nothing: corner shops, markets, textile trade, transport networks. Indian South Africans were able to build family-owned enterprises that sustained generations. They created schools, temples, mosques, cultural organizations, and mutual aid systems. They turned exclusion into self-reliance. And over time, many Indian South Africans became deeply intertwined with the broader fabric of the country, especially within the colored community. community. Because South Africa's racial categories were never natural, they were manufactured. Through shared neighborhoods, shared struggles, intermarriage, language, foods, and faith, many Indian South Africans became and proudly identify as colored. Not as a dilution of identity, but as a reflection of lived reality. The colored identity itself is a testament to survival under empire, conversions of African, Indian, Southeast Asian, and European histories forced together by colonialism and slavery. So when we talk about Indian South Africans, we are not talking about a passive group imported into someone else's struggle. They were and are active participants in resistance. They were architects of survival and co-authors of South Africa's long fight for dignity. Their story is not a footnote, it is foundational. Dutch colonialism laid the foundation, British imperialism expanded it, racial classification hardened it, and apartheid perfected it. The irony is impossible to ignore. The Dutch, once oppressed under Spanish rule, became oppressors themselves. The same people who fought for religious freedom and self-determination now denied those very rights to others. That is what I can get, by the way. I do not understand why someone like Mahatma Gandhi was also fighting for freedom, how he understood being mistreated, being enslaved when he saw his people enslaved. I was like, no, not the African people. Those are lesser people. They deserve to be enslaved. I hate that bitch. I hate her. I hate her.
I hate that bitch. I hate her. I hate that fucking bitch. I fucking hate that fucking bitch.
The same people who fought for religious freedom and self-determination now denied those very rights to others. The Cape Refreshment Station became a blueprint. From it grew racial hierarchy, land dispossession, and the ideology that some lives were meant to rule while others were meant to serve. So when we talk about the Boers or the Dutch, we are not just talking about farmers. We are talking about the early architects of one of the most brutal social experiments in modern history. People capable of innovation, resistance, and brilliance, and at the same time capable of unimaginable cruelty. South Africa didn't inherit division by accident. It was engineered. Now, you know how we roll around these parts. You know how we roll around in these YouTube streets. You have to leave a comment. You must like the video. You have to. And you must subscribe. That is imperative. You must do it. I compel you. Tell me if you agree with all the nonsense I just spewed. Tell me if you hate Mahatma Gandhi with the same vehemence, with the same passion that I do. Tell me if you understood just how Indians have helped shape South Africa, how their culture is so interwoven into South African culture as a whole. Tell me, baby. Na na na, tell me. Is that how it goes? I think that's how it goes. Tell me.